Well, thank you for such a warm welcome. It is great to see so many of you here. It is slightly uncanny timing that today the Community Securities Trust announced a 16% increase in anti-Semitic incidents in the last year. We have seen a rise for 3 years running now. It is at a record high. But we're not competing for relevance tonight on news lines. We're talking about something that I think we have all recognized, globally recognized to be a phenomenon, and it's hard to think of anyone better placed than Deborah Lipstadt to bring us through this incredibly complicated time with more thought and more precision. I have to admit, I'd always thought of anti-Semitism as one thing, Deborah, one whole, until I read this brilliant book, and it tackles it from so many angles. And I suddenly started thinking of sort of Eskimos and Inuits and their 15 different words for snow. And it made me see the subtleties in all the different kinds. Each chapter takes you through a new sort of anti-Semitism. We are, as it were, spoilt for choice. So I don't know how many of you have sort of had a look yet, but Deborah really starts at the beginning: biblical anti-Semitism, white nationalist anti-Semitism, anti-Semitism from the progressive left, from the hard right, dinner party anti-Semitism, careless anti-Semitism, campus anti-Semitism, Islamist anti-Semitism, politically anti-Israel anti-Semitism, and then a very special point at the end, an anti-Semitism that is in danger, perhaps, of redefining a whole culture, a whole religion. So tonight we're going to try and explore as much of that as our time allows, and explore how you find the counter-arguments for what you sense to be happening. I also want to explore the other things that are inherent in all this, that you start to perceive anti-Semitism wherever you go, yes, that you see it too widely. I think it was Danny Finkelstein used to tell me about joking with his schoolmates growing up. You know, he'd play football, and when the ball hit the goalpost, be like, oh, anti-Semitic goal, you know, the anti-Semitic, you know, whatever it was. And he was laughing clearly, but for some it can dominate, and it can overtake the actual focus on Judaism itself. What happens when a culture or a faith starts to see itself purely in the antagonism that it confronts, which is a very different sort of place that we may end up. Deborah and I will be in conversation for about 40 minutes, and then we are delighted to open it up to all of you, and we welcome your questions. I anticipate there will probably be very heartfelt experiences. Maybe that will be more than direct questions, and that's absolutely fine. Just the briefer, the more succinct you are, the more of you we can include, which is what we'd love to do. Enough from me. Deborah Lipstadt, let's start at the beginning, because you do talk about where it comes from, which is one of the oddest things of all, the sort of biblical anti-Semitism, yes, coming from the Adam and Eve, or the Eve and snake. What's your understanding of the origins of it?
I'm going to jump from the Hebrew scriptures to the New Testament, because that's really where I see the roots of it, or the template. In the story of the death of Jesus, of the crucifixion, as it has been taught and understood by church fathers, and I'm not being sexist here because it was mainly fathers, that the reason or stepping back, the Jews, of course, Jesus was a Jew, the Jews were Jews, everyone in the story is Jewish except the Romans who actually crucified him, but that's an extraneous fact. The Jews wanted Jesus killed, crucified, because he wanted to chase the money changers out of the temple. And they persuaded Rome. The Roman authorities didn't want to do that, but they persuaded Rome to do it. Crucify him, crucify him. And in that story, and the way that story was taught by many church leaders over millennia, you have the template for anti-Semitic charges. Anti-Semitism is not if you dislike a Jew. Go to any synagogue and you'll find, or synagogue board meeting, trustees, governors, and you find, Jews disagreeing and hating those other Jews. But anti-Semitism will have those elements. Something to do with money, something to do with intelligence, with smarts, but clever, nefarious, and a malicious use of power. So that even when I talk about my friends, quote unquote, the deniers, if you were to ask a denier, well, why did the Jews make up this story? What is in it for them? The denier would say to you, well, what did the Jews get out of the Holocaust? And the traditional answer, even though this is historically open to debate, a state of Israel and reparations, which is a fancy word for money. So therefore, you have in that charge that same template, money, and they got the Allies, they managed to get the Allies to do their bidding, to plant evidence so that they could get a state. Even though it would cause disruption in the Middle East, it might disadvantage of people who were there, but so it's the same template.
So before we get up to the Holocaust, this idea that the narrative established with Jesus and the Pharisees started the whole projection, if you like,
Yes.
of anti-Semitism. I mean, that seems extraordinary, that has never wavered from that place, or do you think there have been periods of time when it has disappeared?
I think it's there. First of all, I call anti-Semitism the longest or the oldest hatred. Other historians have used that term as well. And it's got very deep roots. Now, this is a discomforting analogy, but I speak of anti-Semitism, I think of anti-Semitism as a herpes virus. You know, once you have herpes, for many years, now they have medicine that can actually eradicate it, but for many years it was always in you, it was always lying dormant. And we all hear the horror stories of the bride who wakes up the morning of her wedding with a herpes sore on her lip or something, because it comes out under moments of stress. Anti-Semitism is deeply embedded in society, and not just Western society. It's migrated to Muslim society, it's migrated to other societies. And in times of tension, in times of global dislocation, I think it emerges. Or when there are politicians, right or left, who want to use it to gin up support, it's a very convenient way to do it.
Okay, so you've taken me right into the right and left. Let's start with the right. And you very early on talk about the Charlottesville rallies and President Trump in 2017 and Trump's reaction to the death of one woman at the hands of a far-right demonstrator. Now, the phrase that has been used to me quite often in America in 2017 was, the Ku Klux Klan have taken their hoods off. It's the same people, they just don't feel the need to disguise their faces anymore. Do you sense that there is growing, or is it like the herpes, just louder? You're just seeing the cold sore?
I think it's both. I think it's growing. You hear too many stories, too many anecdotes, and one is always loath to make generalization of anecdotes, but if you hear them enough, you begin to say something is happening here, of young people, of people on the street being accosted, things being yelled at them, things being said to them, dinner party conversations where people feel that they can say certain things that they couldn't say before. They can express certain things that they couldn't express before. And in my country, it's not just in relation to Jews, but it's also in relation to immigrants, refugees, people of color, etc. So I think that it's the mask is off, or the cover is off, and more people have picked up on it, so it's both.
And when people say, come on, you know, you're overplaying this, it's not exactly the 1930s, you know, we're not about to see fascism take over the world, get it in perspective. What's your answer to that?
My answer to that is it's not like the 1930s. If you think about the reaction to Pittsburgh, governments worldwide condemned what happened, or when studies come out showing anti-Semitism. This is not government, by and large. There are governments, and we could talk about Hungary, Poland, United States. No, well, we can talk about it. I don't think it's the 1930s, but you have to remember that genocide never begins with the decision by the genocideer to kill. It begins first with words. Think about Rwanda, the radio stations from the Congo. It begins with incitement. So I don't know where it's going, and I don't think it's going towards a genocide, but it was going far enough so that 11 people who went to synagogue on an October morning in Pittsburgh are dead. And those kind of things are not easily sloughed off.
You've talked about the right and the left. Do you think there is a difference of approach?
Yes. I think here's the irony. The right looks upon the Jew as not being white. That murderer who went into the Tree of Life synagogue was yelling about the Jews destroying the white people because this synagogue had sponsored a Shabbat in support of HIAS, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, which was started to aid immigrants, Jewish immigrants, and now aids refugees and immigrants worldwide. And for him, Jews were not white, and Jews were destroying his country by aiding refugees and aiding immigrants to come into the country. On the left, you see less violence, but you see more institutionalization. And, the 900-pound whatever sitting in the middle of the room, of course, is the Labor Party and Jeremy Corbyn. And I'm loath to come to, bring coals to Newcastle or, to talk about something local when I'm not a local. But I think, it was one commentator who said that, Jeremy Corbyn rarely, or if ever, meets an anti-Semite that he doesn't somehow find a reason to embrace. Now, I'm not suggesting, and I want to be very clear here, I'm not suggesting that he's necessarily an anti-Semite. I have no idea what's in his heart, and I think that's irrelevant. I think the whole conversation is this person an anti-Semite or not, is irrelevant. I think what is relevant is, does their behavior facilitate anti-Semitism? Does their behavior gin up, whip up anti-Semitic sentiments? And I think in that case, it's case closed for Jeremy Corbyn and to a certain degree for Donald Trump.
You quote Alan Johnson, a former Labour Health Secretary, amongst other things, as describing Corbyn as someone who does not indulge in anti-Semitism himself, but indulges the anti-Semitism of others.
That's not Alan Johnson, the politician. It's Alan Johnson, misidentified in the book. It's Alan Johnson, the scholar.
I thought that was unusually forthcoming.
Right, no.
Cross that one off.
But in any case, I think that's a very apt comment. It's a very apt comment. I think that if a person such as Jeremy Corbyn, the people around him, or other progressives, people now sitting in the House of Representatives in the United States, were to encounter an anti-Semite who looked like a Hitler variety, an extremist, that there was no question that this was an anti-Semite, talking about love of Nazism, or the Charlottesville people marching down the street with their arm outstretched, chanting, "Jews will not replace us." They would recognize those as anti-Semites. But when you move away from that extremist variety and you get to the other varieties, when you get to the dinner party anti-Semite, when you get to the person, talk about Israel, first of all, to, again, say something which I think many people in this audience would know, but criticism of Israeli policies is not anti-Semitism. If you want to see criticism of Israeli policies, read Haaretz, Go to the Knesset and sit in on a debate on the Knesset, and you'll see extreme criticism.
Deborah, I don't want to get too ahead of this, because I think that's a fascinating area, and I really want to come to that in some detail.
So let me go back just to...
But the Corbyn thing, right. I have to put myself in the place where I'm responding for Jeremy Corbyn or for Donald Trump. Their right of reply is right because they're not in the room. If you heard from Corbyn that what he objected to was not, as you say, anti-Semitism, it was the things that you have, if you like, associated with Jews, the Jewish tropes, capitalism, unfair use of power, right? Now, I don't want to put words into his mouth, but we've heard this sort of thing before, that this is not, this is not about Jews, it's about not liking the way the capitalist world works and shaking that down.
I think that that explanation has sort of run its course when you look at the record of this man and the people around him. I think the problem is that progressives, amongst them Jeremy Corbyn, certainly not him alone, their Weltanschauung, their worldview is shaped, or they see the world through a prism. And that prism, prism bends light, that prism has two facets, ethnic and class. And they look at the Jew, whom they see as white, and I say ironically the people on the far right don't see Jews as white, and they look at the Jew as a person of privilege, even though there are lots of Jews who are not people of privilege. And they say, you are not a racial minority or an ethnic minority or a gender minority. You have privilege. You cannot possibly be a victim of prejudice. Ipso facto, therefore, you must be making this claim either to attack me falsely or to, attack me for my support of the Palestinians, or whatever it might be. And it can have no relation to the Middle East. But they don't take it seriously. Whereas if a racial minority came and said, I was the victim of prejudice, they would accept it. But they say, no, I'm going to define anti-Semitism. And their definition leaves a lot to be desired.
So if you were the Jew in the room at that point, you don't want to be competing for minority victim status.
No, not at all.
So where do you take that then? Where do you, when you get that sense of you're white, you're privileged, you're educated, and you might be 2 out of 3 or
That's
3
right.
out of 3.
I think you take it to the fact that, and again, I don't like the consistent Holocaust analogies, but here something does work. The Jews in Germany were well integrated, well acculturated, many of them well educated. Most of the Nobel Prize won by Germany at that point had been won by Germans of Jewish descent. They never dreamt that they could be dislocated in society. The Jewish experience, every prejudice is distinct, the experience of every group with prejudice is distinct, but the Jewish experience makes it very clear that status and seeming power does not protect you from animosity and hatred. So yes, I may have a degree, I may have multiple degrees from good universities, and I may be comfortable, but that doesn't mean I can't be the object of hatred and the object of discrimination and the object of prejudice.
And this idea of something that feels like assimilation but isn't entirely, you raise with the idea of the dinner party anti-Semite or the local country golf club, just that sense that nobody's not invited you, but you haven't quite been welcomed.
Or I had an experience when I was fresh out of graduate school, my first job at the University of Washington in Seattle, a very fine university, and I was in the history department, the first time they had someone teaching Jewish history. In fact, the first time in the university that anybody on a Jewish topic, yes, if you taught contemporary American literature, you were teaching Bellow and Roth and, Malamud, you were teaching Jews. But this was a dedicated historian on Jewish history. And it was great. They loved me, I loved them. It was it clicked in every aspect. And after being there about 6 to 8 months, one of my colleagues took me out for coffee. And he said, Deborah, I have to tell you that when I heard that the person who had gotten the job, gotten the position, there were lots of candidates and that you had been chosen, was a Jewish woman from New York, I was really nervous. But you're terrific. You know, it's the sum of my best friends are. I remember when I was young, I was once with my father, and we had gone into a store, and I don't know, somehow the man knew he was Jewish, maybe he was buying something for the synagogue, whatever it was, and the man said, "Oh, Mr. Lipstadt, some of my best friends are Jews." And when we walked out, I said, "Oh, that's so nice, isn't that nice?" And my father said to me, "Do you ever hear someone boast some of my best friends are white Anglo-Saxon Protestants?" You know, if you're boasting about having some of your best friends, you think, "Oh, I'm doing something terrific. I'm being friends with them."
And would you call that out now?
Now I would call it out. Now I would. Then I just choked on my coffee, but now I would call it out.
The other one you talk about is and this comes very close, is the clueless anti-Semite. And this is always a slightly delicate area because we've all managed to offend and be offensive without there being malice behind it. And you talk about the person who says, "Oh, come with me to set, you'll love a bargain, you'll spot a bargain." It's the thing that you might not notice for a split second, and then you kind of look behind you to see where it came.
And I think those people should be educated, the anecdote I tell is of a friend of mine who had just finished nursing school. And she lived in New York, her family was in New York, but the friends she made in nursing school were all from the Midwest, from smaller towns. They had never really interacted with Jews. And they were in New York, they were adopted by my friend's family. They would go there for Friday night dinner, for Passover Seder. They just loved it. So there was no malice, absolutely no malice. And she says to my friend at the very end, "Oh, I'm going to miss New York, but there's one store I have to take you to, Barbara. You're going to really love it. You can get real my friend was the only Jew at the table. You're going to get real bargains." And my friend, you know, unlike the experience where you wake up in the middle of the night, "I should have said this," or my friend was quick enough on the draw to say, "I didn't know Jews were the only ones wise enough to want to save their hard-earned money." And the other woman got it. Sometimes, you know, it's the same thing with racism. We will say things that we don't realize are racially offensive. And you have to be called on it, and something has to be educated. You have to be educated.
She was absolutely sure in that circumstance that had been aimed specifically at her. But we're in this very sort of febrile atmosphere at the moment with microaggression, and you have to decide that the little aggressions that are not particularly badly meant, they hit at a nerve that is often racially or culturally or sort of sexually understood.
It's a delicate thing, and you don't want everybody censoring so that there's nothing is said, you know, except you're talking about the quality of the food in front of you or something. But
I mean, let me put it this way. When do you embrace the Jewish characteristics, the tendency to be an overfeeder, the whole idea of the Jap, the ability for Jews...
The Jap is sexist and anti-Semitic.
So that goes straight out. All right. As in the Jewish American princess. I should spell that out just because it's not something that the UK audience necessarily uses. But what about the others? I mean, if you think that the Jew that's good with money, or the Jew that is, means to power, or the networks of power, or the globalist are negative tropes, where does that merge into the ones that a lot of people who are Jewish quite embrace, the inability to ever turn up or leave anywhere on time, the inability to stop pushing more food down people's throats, the inability to stop arguing
even with yourself. What about the Italian mother? Mangia.
It's exactly the same. So I guess what I'm asking is, at what point do you feel offended by all of that?
I think Mrs. Maitlis is showing here, and it's caused a lot of discussion. Is it stereotyping certain things? I happen to love the show. And yes, there are stereotypes in there. I think, first of all, the question is, what's the intent? What's the intent of the person? And this guy who was saying to me, I was afraid you're a New York Jewish woman, but you're terrific, he thought he was giving me a compliment.
But the bargain one was not badly meant.
No, it was not badly meant. And when my friend pointed it out to her, this other woman said, "Oh my God, I never even thought about that." You know, and being on time and being late. You know, I was taught by one of my African-American colleagues when I was telling them, oh, we Jews are never on time. So we've got CPT. I said, what's CPT? Colored people's time. I mean, this was an African-American teaching me. So every group has its stereotypes, of course, and I'm not saying you can't engage in them. But when they become a foil for something else, when they become this backhanded compliment, when they play on dangerous stereotypes. You know, the dinner party anti-Semite who will say, oh, we just hired a new young lawyer at our firm. He's Jewish, but he's really good. He's really honest. He's really a hard worker.
You use the example of Anthony Julius, who, of course, defended you when you were called to trial by David Irving, which I know people will be fascinated to hear more about from your mouth. But the way that the Telegraph wrote up earlier Anthony Julius as Princess Diana's divorce lawyer as having a sort of uncanny knack.
Yes.
Wasn't it?
The son of a haberdasher, they called him. I don't know how that was relevant, but, you know, and a Labor Party member, and someone who doesn't know fair play. And then they interviewed someone who had taught him at Cambridge and who said, oh, they better, the royal family better be careful, he's going to get a lot of money out of them. Those were those weren't even clueless, those weren't dinner party, that was just plain old anti-Semitism. You know, that's how and then the Telegraph, of course, backtracked and said, you know, we're sorry if Mr. Julius was offended. I'm paraphrasing here. Well, of course he was offended. You know, it's sort of like, if anybody was hurt by my saying this racist thing, if any African-American, I apologize.
Yeah. If you were too touchy. Were too touchy.
Right.
Yeah.
It's a pretty sorry way of apologizing.
I want to move us forward to this phrase that you use. And it's a really, I found it quite hard to define, but it's a fascinating one because it has sort of many layers. You call it the yes, but. Will you talk us through what that is? I know you're talking about the case of Salman Rushdie at the beginning, and it's this idea that liberal thinkers can have this slightly bizarre relationship with things that feel too sensitive. So at the time of Salman Rushdie, you know, of course, now we're in the 30-year anniversary of that. There were liberal thinkers who would say... A lot of liberal thinkers, and the chief rabbi, I think, was amongst them, who would say, you know, nobody wants to see this happen, but he, in brackets, he brought it upon himself.
You know, that's like saying, you hear the story of a woman being raped.
Yeah.
And you say, yes, it's terrible she was raped, but what was she doing on the street at 1 o'clock in the morning walking by herself? And then the person might say, well, she's a nurse, and she usually gets off at 11 and leaves the hospital with a whole group of people to go to the parking lot to get her car. But she was involved in an emergency case saving the young child's life, so she had to leave at 1 by, then she becomes a worthy victim. You know, so it's the same thing, yes. Well, yes, it's terrible that there was a fatwa against Salman Rushdie, but he should never have written that. These simple sentences, you don't kill someone for what, or order a death sentence for someone for what they write. End of conversation, end of, you know.
Yeah, this is the New York Times, murder is not an acceptable form of literary criticism.
Exactly, that's right.
So, it's the kind of thing, if you'd pen that, you'd just put your pen down and sort of retire, wouldn't you?
Exactly.
So where do you see that in the
Well, I see a lot
argument?
of that, you know. Yes, it's terrible what Hitler did, but the Jews were very wealthy in Germany, you know. Yes, it's terrible after Pittsburgh. I think it was Dame Jenny Tong, is that liberal Dem, who, I'm paraphrasing it, but she tweeted, this is awful, but when will Netanyahu learn that his policy... This had nothing to do with Israel. This had nothing to do with Benjamin Netanyahu.
So I think we call that, I suppose the equivalent is what we call whataboutery.
Yep.
So when somebody raises one thing, you slap something else
down
in the way straight away.
That's exactly right. And I don't think it was right with Salman Rushdie. I don't think it's right in terms of Pittsburgh. And I don't think it's right when it's used in many different ways. Yeah.
So give us, I mean, this takes us to the hub of things, really, because we know even really smart, well-informed, educated people will come to an argument against anti-Semitism and say, yeah, but you should be allowed to criticize Israel. That's the thing you hear most often, isn't it, within a sort of progressive conversation or situation. I'm not anti-Semitic, but I should be allowed to criticize Israel.
Absolutely, you should be allowed. I mean, there's no question. As I said earlier, read Haaretz, go to a Knesset debate. You'll hear people screaming at each other. You'll think you're at a synagogue board meeting, you know? But of course you should be allowed to criticize Israel. There's no country that shouldn't have its policies criticized. Its founding myths, you know, there are those who say, well, I don't believe there should be a Jewish state because there were things done wrong in the founding of Israel. And yes, there were Palestinians who left because they were told by their leaders, you'll be back in a few days. And there were Palestinians who were forced out by the Haganah, the Zionist forces. But I can think of other countries that have difficult moments in their founding myths, such as the United States and its treatment of Native Americans, Australia, its treatment of the Aborigines, Canada, its treatment of what's called the First Peoples. But you know, of course you can criticize, but when there is a myopic concentration on Israel to the exclusion of all other wrongs, when just heard this story Monday in New York. A teacher in a New York City public school, Jewish teacher, a student approached him and said, I'd like a letter of recommendation for a summer course that I want to do. And the teacher said, of course. She brought him the forms. He said, oh, this is for a summer in Israel. I can't sign it. So this student, I would love to have her as a student, a high school student says to her teacher, are there any other countries you wouldn't sign a program for? She said, if I was going to Saudi Arabia, where if I went outside the confines of the campus, I'd have to dress a certain way, I couldn't drive, I couldn't go by myself, I'd have to take a man with me, etc. He said, no, I'd sign for that. She said, what if I was going to North Korea? And there are American kids, one of them got killed there by the North Koreans. He said, oh, I'd sign for that, that would be a good learning, but not for Israel.
So
there's something crazy there.
How has that been allowed to take root then? Because it is still the thing that you will hear most often, you know, oh, I don't like, you know, the way Israel does politics or whatever it is. So how do you think, I mean, when you put it in context, it sounds absolutely gobsmackingly clear, right? That it's being held to some standard that no other country in the world is being held to. How has that narrative been allowed to take shape and
well, I think it goes back to what I was saying at the beginning. When you're dealing with something with such long roots, you know, the joke that they say was told by German Jews in the 30s, that the Nazi leader who comes to a rally and says, the Jews are our misfortune, the Jews have done this, the Jews have done that, and someone yells out, and the bicycle riders, and the Nazi turns to the person and says, why the bicycle riders, and the other person says, why the Jews, you know? It's got these roots. If I were to say to you, I had a terrible time getting here, the traffic was awful, because everyone was out to stop me. You'd say, Deborah, we're going to the psychiatrist. You know, but if I say to you, oh, this happened to me because Jews came into began to open the business just like mine nearby, and they undercut me, and it resonates. If you've been raised in Western society, you've got to fight. It's the same thing with racism. Certainly in my country. It's endemic in the society. It's built in. It's there. And the problem with prejudice is that when every prejudice has its own stereotype. Prejudice itself is irrational. Think of the etymology of the word, prejudge. Don't confuse me with the facts. I've made up my mind. But it makes sense to you. If you say, you know, there are gangs in my neighborhood or gangs have infiltrated my neighborhood, most people, I would say, certainly in the United States, will assume that they're black kids who have done this. You know, you go to what you're used to in this stereotype, and anti-Semitism has a lot of millennia to embed itself.
But you are talking about places of education, academic institutes, some of the sort of, you know, if you like, finest minds, most thoughtful people who get embroiled in this question of, I don't know if people will be familiar with this, BDS, the whole idea of boycott, divestment, sanctions, and start following the rules that they apply to Israel that they don't apply to other countries.
Not to China, not to Myanmar, not to any place else.
So how, I mean, I ask you the same question again, and I know I'm sort of, bashing against a wall in a way. It's not just, the guy next door who feels a bit threatened by the immigrant who's moved in, who's, doing the jobs for cheaper. Or that's kind of understandable to some extent because it's your livelihood getting affected. It's in universities. I think it happens more in the US, but it happens here too.
Oh, it happens a lot here.
And it has been, it's become acceptable.
You can be a PhD and an SOB at the same time, You say SOB.
We do now.
Son of a... look, just as a historical factoid, the mobile killing units, the people who went and shot Jews on the Eastern Front prior to the establishment of death camps, there were 4 major mobile killing units. And each one had a person in charge, a SS officer in charge. 3 of them had PhDs. One was an ordained minister. One had 2 PhDs, I think in economics and in law. I hate to say it because it's where I put my life, but education is not an automatic antidote. I think it's got to come with a morality from home. It's got to come from morality with the society, but it's not as much as we'd love to think of it as an automatic antidote against hatred, I don't think it is.
Okay, I'm going to be braver on this one. Do you think it happens because it hits a nerve with Jewish intellectuals and professors themselves who feel it's not something that they can push back against?
I think it does. I think people feel very uncomfortable. I think there are many, first of all, there are Jews who engage in this. As I said, this teacher was a Jew that I gave the example of. But I think there is a discomfort. I think people don't know quite how to put their hands around it. It's one of the reasons I wrote the book. It's one of the reasons that I wrote it. You described it earlier when we were backstage, is it accessible. I want it to be accessible. I didn't want to write an academic tome that would be read by 10 people. I started to write it as a straight academic book, citing studies and research and statistics. And it had, as I told the London Jewish Chronicle, it had no juice. That's J-U-I-C-E. Had lots of J-E-W-S's, but no J-U-I's. I was falling asleep writing it. It was so boring. It was awful. And a friend called me, and she said, Deborah, do letters. And that's when it clicked. So I pick as you know, I pick a creative fictional Jewish student, progressive on the left, who's encountering this anti-Semitism, and a non-Jewish colleague in the law school who doesn't quite understand it, doesn't get it, and they're writing me with questions. Here's somehow a reversal of what's usually the case. Usually people will pick historical figures and put words into their mouth. These are fictional characters, but the words they speak, the questions they ask me in their letters are all things that I've encountered. Yeah. So I put those together and use that format.
And it's true, so the whole book is formatted around the questions that these 2 characters ask. And one of the moments, or one of the questions, is about, and you've been right in the middle of Holocaust denial, the trial with David Irving, why you would give anyone who is self-evidently spouting tosh or lies the time of day. Now, obviously, in your case, you were called to that trial by him. He was trying to sue you, wasn't he?
He sued me.
He sued you.
He wasn't trying, he did.
He did.
One of my lawyers, James is here, my lawyer's here. So I bring him along wherever I go.
Just in case an antagonistic audience tonight. But the question she asks, and I think we've, certainly in broadcasting, we in news, we constantly have this debate with ourselves, is do you expose, do you listen, do you bring them up, or do you just say, you're so irrelevant and you're not making any sense, why would we give you the oxygen?
Yes. It's a challenge that I faced when I first started writing about deniers. Was I giving them oxygen by writing about them? But I felt at that point they were out there enough, they were confusing people enough that they had their lies and their modus operandi had to be exposed, and that's what I wanted to do. I refused consistently, and I still do, to enter into a debate with them because they're liars. You know, they're facts, their opinions, and their lies. They're in the lying category. That's what we showed in the trial, that we followed David Irving's footnotes, and we showed he consistently lied, distorted information, turned things around, made up things that weren't in the documents. But I never would have taken him to court. I never would have sued him because I don't believe history belongs in the courtroom. And I was bemused, I would say, at the end when there were some people who said, well, you know, poor David Irving, he could never have withstood such a close look at his work. Well, if he can't withstand it, he shouldn't have sued me in the first place, you know.
So, am I right in thinking that you would now refuse to be on a panel or in a conversation with...
Absolutely. Because you can't trust what he's saying.
But is there anything that you could learn from somebody who was anti-Semitic? Is there anything that would help you in your work?
Yes, you can learn how dangerous hatred can be. You can learn how facts can be twisted. You can learn how insidious it can be. I read their stuff.
You do?
I don't follow. People will call me and say, did you see what David Irving wrote about you on his blog or on his website? And I'll say, I'll tell you the truth. He stole 7 years of my life, 6 to 7 years of my life from beginning to end. I'm not giving him any more time. But I do read the anti-Semitic stuff, and it's really quite familiar. But
that's a euphemism. That means
I've seen
it so many times before.
But I'm not going to enter into a conversation with an anti-Semite because he's a liar, he's a distorter. I will debate someone on an issue about which I feel passionately, gun control. In my country, we have this illness of guns. I'm losing my mic here. Or abortion. But I have to know that the person is not going to make up facts. If they're making things up, it's like trying to nail a blob of jelly to the wall. You can't do it. So that's why I won't enter into a debate.
I'm going to open the floor up to questions in a second. There's just one area, and it's something that really sort of struck a chord, which I mentioned at the beginning. And funny enough, I think I encountered it myself earlier this week when I was speaking to a rabbi's wife, and she came up and she said, "Oh, Emily, yeah, how are you? Fine. How bad has it been for you?" And that was the conversation for the next 15 minutes. And I, of course, just finished reading your book, and I thought you call it the chapter which is joy, not oi, you know. Not everything about Judaism, about culture, about faith has to start and end with a conversation about anti-Semitism,
right.
Because otherwise you sort of erode all the bits in between.
That's right. You lose sight. When you make oppression, and this goes certainly for anti-Semites, but it could go for any group that's been oppressed. When your sense of identity, whether it's as a gay person, whether it's as a person of color, whether it's as a Jew, whatever it might be, if your sense of identity is controlled by the hatred against you, what you've done is you've ceded to the oppressor control over your identity, A. And certainly in terms of Jewish tradition, you've given up, you've ignored, you've rendered, meaningless or unimportant all the positive aspects of Jewish tradition. And when I say tradition, I'm not talking only religion, though that certainly is part of it. Jewish teachings, culture, art, history, literature, however one expresses their Jewish identity, it shouldn't be because of the anti-Semite, it should be despite the anti-Semite.
So going back then to Danny Finkelstein and the goalpost, do you ever think you've become too aware of it? Do you ever think you see anti-Semitism even in places it doesn't exist?
I don't think so. I mean, when the plane is late, I know it's an anti-Semitic air traffic controller who doesn't want me to... But other than that, no. No, I don't think so. In fact, in the book, I'm somewhat critical of those, including Israeli leaders, who, when there's criticism of their policies by others, will sometimes describe it as anti-Semitism. I think we have to be very careful. Anti-Semitism is a conspiracy theory. It's a delusion. Jews are capitalists, Jews are communists, Jews are pushy and they want to be in places that don't want them, Jews are clannish. You can't be clannish and pushy. You can't be a capitalist and a communist at the same time. Yes, they would say that about George Soros, but that's an anti-Semitic attack too.
That brings me on. I'm going to ask you one last question before we open up, because that takes to a very interesting place, which is when you look at Jewish leadership, political leadership in Israel, I don't mean Jewish, I mean Israeli prime ministers and leaders, what do you understand by them embracing the sort of the strong men, whether it's Orban, whether it's Trump, whether it's, this assumption, and I know that Orban's got this sort of very odd relationship where he thinks he's doing the Jews a favor by keeping the Muslims out. It's this very odd sort of
I think it's a very dangerous thing, and I'm quite critical of the current Israeli government for that policy of embracing Orban, embracing when the Poles made a cosmetic change in the law about the Holocaust, changing the penalty from criminal to civil. That was all they essentially did, one or two other changes, but still, it's a form of soft-core Holocaust denial, not denying the facts, but denying the Polish involvement in it and the Polish collaboration. Listen, a State Department study was just released from 1945 where an American official in Poland is reporting that Polish Jews who survived the Holocaust are flocking to get into Germany because they're afraid of their Polish neighbors. So, but I'm very disturbed by the cavorting, the acceptance, the embrace of these people who are anti-Semites, even though I know there's a matter of realpolitik. Politics makes strange bedfellows. A person who engages in that kind of anti-Semitism, using Viktor Orban as the main example, but there are others, Prime Minister of Hungary, that's not a reliable partner. And if you're going to claim to be the worldwide defender of Jews all over wherever they may be, against anti-Semitism, you cannot make common cause with an anti-Semite.
Right. I'm going to open up the floor now. There's a lady just here with a stripy top, and there's one here, and then there's a gentleman just there afterwards. We've got another mic. How many mics have we got? Just two. Let's have you two, and then we'll pass them on.
Hi. The title of the talk show is How to Combat Anti-Semitism, and I just wondered what your tips would be, or if you have some specific tips on how to combat anti-Semitism for some of the people that are here.
Yes, I would say there are a number of things. You have to become what I call the unwelcome guest at the dinner party. You may be told somebody has arranged a family dinner and someone says, well, Uncle XYZ is bringing this person and we know that they're a homophobe or we know they're an anti-Semite or whatever it might be. Don't get into it with him. When he says that horrible comment, or she says, not to be sexist, when she says that horrible comment, just let it go, because we want to have a nice evening. We can't afford to do that anymore. As I like to say, we can't afford to do, not because we're going to change the mind of the anti-Semite or the homophobe or the racist, but we have to telegraph the message to the other people at the table that when those kind of comments are made, we don't sit idly by. We don't just accept them. That we don't agree with them, and we don't agree with them being made at our table or a table where I'm present. So I think that's one thing we have to do. In terms of social media, it used to be when I first started to write about Holocaust deniers, if you wanted to get denial material, you would get it in a plain brown envelope with no return address to a post office box, because you didn't, and you'd hope it'd get mailed. Now you just have to go to Mrs. Google and click on one or two things and you'll find the deniers. In this day and age of social media, I love social media. I couldn't have written this book without social media, without Facebook, without Google, with other search engines. But every gift comes with responsibilities. We have this great gift of communication and this great gift of finding knowledge. We have to be exceptionally careful about how we use it. I recently saw something posted where someone, a far-right Republican, had said something awful, misogynist and racist and anti-Semitic. It was really as a work of art all at one time. And I said, this is awful. I'm going to post this. I'm going to tweet about it. I'm going to post it, wherever. And then just as I was about to hit, the post the tweet button, I said, wait a minute. If this guy really said it, I want to see how others are reporting it. And I went looking for it, and it turns out the source I was going to post is the only source that reported on it. That's not a reliable source. We've got to be careful on that. I think that's another thing. And we have to, and that's one of the reasons I wrote the book, and thank you on talking about the accessibility of it. I wrote it that way. We've got to educate ourselves to recognize when is the person just a fool and when are they an anti-Semitic fool. When is it just a bungling kind of comment, and when is it something made with intent? And how do we call them out? How do we respond? How do we educate them? Because even though I flippantly made the comment, you can be a PhD in an SOB, I'm still teaching. I'm still going into the classroom. I'm still trying to educate. So I think those are some of the ways.
You had the other mic.
Yeah. When you said there was a situation about he's Jewish but he's all right, I immediately remembered something about Second World War, which to me is one of the most horrible things, which was useful Jew. How do you think this notion exists now? Does it exist, useful Jew? Is that the same thing? He's Jewish but he is all right.
Yeah, I think it does. I think it does exist. He's Jewish, but he's a good lawyer, so I'm going to go to him, that kind of thing. I mean, I think it was Anthony Julius who once pointed out to me during my trial, when I was talking about a lawyer joke, and he said, take lawyer jokes and replace lawyer with Jew, and the joke still works. In other words, they're subtly anti-Semitic in that way. I think it still does exist. I think it's part of the whole syndrome we've been talking about.
Couple more. Yeah. I'll let you find me some disparate hands. Yes. Sir. Yep. The mic's right there. And one more here. Yes. Great. Yep. That lady right behind you.
How do you combat Jews behaving badly?
Generally badly or badly anti-Semitic?
I mean,
yes, I know. Well, you have. I think it was Howard Jacobson in the Finkler question, that wonderful, wonderful book that somehow managed to win the Man Booker Prize. I never quite figured that. I'm glad it did. I think it's a great novel. But he talks about characters in the book who discovered that they were Jewish when it came time to be critical of Israel. As a Jew. When someone starts a statement saying, as a Jew, I want to, criticize this, that, or the other, it's very difficult. But you can be black and be racist. You can be Jewish and be anti-Semitic. There's one of the sad things about prejudice is when you internalize the prejudicial elements. I was in Stockholm last week to take part in the events of Holocaust Remembrance Day, and I was invited by a government agency called the Forum for Living History. And one day, one of my minders, who was taking me from one event to another, woman who works for the Forum, teaches and instructs and guides groups through their exhibit, etc. I asked her background, or I just asked her how she came to this, and she told me, I'm a Roma. What some people call gypsies, which is a derogatory term. I'm a Roma, and that's how I came to be involved. And then she told me a story that Roma in Sweden, when they used to get to a town, if they were wanderers, if they were moved around, first thing they would do is go to the police station to register, because if they didn't, they know the police would come and find them and kick them out. So you had a little notebook, and the police would write in it when you came, and you kept the notebook. And then when you left the town, you would go back to the police, and the police would say, this Roma family was here for 2 weeks and nothing was stolen. This Roma family worked on this farm for a year and nobody disappeared. Things like that. She told me that when she was 15 years old, and I shared this story actually with the foreign minister and the crown princess, when she was 14 or 15 years old, her grandmother showed her the family book. And her grandmother showed her the book with great pride. Look, our family. We've never been involved. We've never been accused of stealing anything. We've never been accused of any murderers. She was very proud of it. And this woman said, now she's a grown woman with grown children, she said, even at 14 or 15, I knew there was something very wrong with that. She had absorbed the negative characteristics. That's one of the dangers. That's why I end the book talking about joy versus oi, when you let the oppressor define who you are.
Yes.
Deborah, thank you so much for being here with us this evening. We're clearly in a time where anti-Semitism and homophobia and xenophobia are not dormant. If you think back on the last few decades of history, where do you see us going globally in terms of the rise of tremendous hatred? Do you see things getting worse, or do you think that there will come a time within the next decade where we'll look back at history and say, we were able to combat some of this hatred and things got better?
I'm a historian. Sure. And historians deal with what was. I'm not a sociologist. Sociologists predict trends, and their saving grace is nobody remembered what they predicted, so you don't know if they're right or wrong. I often say at the end of the year when they do the news roundup, 10 predictions for next year, I want to know what they predicted the year before and see their track record on it before. But in any case, I don't predict. I don't know. I don't know where things are going. If you had told me 4 years ago that I would write this book, because for years I've railed against Jews who have always, it's getting worse, the Chicken Little syndrome. Now I feel it is getting worse. But in the introduction to the book, I write the fact that it was a very hard book to write. It was a hard book to write because every day there seemed to be something happening. In fact, my editor said to me about the third week in August, Deborah, you have one more week. I had the copy-edited manuscript. I was adding stuff. Jeremy Corbyn in Tunis, Netanyahu's embrace of the Polish Holocaust law, a woman murdered, a Holocaust survivor murdered in Paris, et cetera, et cetera. She said, Deborah, in a week, I have to have it, otherwise we won't get it out by publication date. So at that point, I wrote, it was a hard book to write because it was about the present. It was a hard book to finish with everything that's been going on. But as a historian, I don't predict, but I'm willing to predict that by the time this book appears, something will have happened that should have been included. I hit send on September 1, and at the end of October came Pittsburgh. So Pittsburgh shocked me. It didn't surprise me, but it shocked me. So I can't predict. I do know that if good people sit idly by and don't become the unwelcome guests at the dinner party, continue to not challenge people, keep quiet like I kept quiet as that young assistant professor, then it will only get worse.
2 more questions. You, sir.
Hi, Deborah. Have you ever changed the mind of an anti-Semite, part one? And secondly, what's your take on Liam Neeson?
On Liam Neeson? Have I ever changed my mind? I know you have to ask an anti-Semite. I have spoken with people, and I know friends of mine, including very fine sociologists, so I apologize that, that was a joke, before, who have worked with right-wing extremists who have left the groups that were dragging them to the far right. And they say it's very hard because it's so easy to get sucked back in. I don't know if I've changed someone's mind. I hope I have, but the truth of the matter is I wasn't trying to change David Irving or deniers' minds when I wrote my book on denial, the one that David Irving sued me about. I'm trying to reach the people who might hear it, who might be confused, who might think, that's not quite right, but I can't put my finger on it. How do I respond? What's wrong with that? I'm not going to, the hardcore people, you know, I think it's, to use a very academic term, not academic term, it's farfallen, it's Yiddish, it's useless. I don't know that it helps. Liam Neeson, I don't know, I don't want to jump into this, you know, everybody's jumping on him right now. I think it was, it's unfortunate. I think he was painfully honest about his reaction, but I think he said it wasn't racist, which I find hard to believe. But you know, we have in the United States, we have a governor who said he did dress up in blackface, didn't dress up in blackface. I don't know, but I didn't mean anything by it. I'm sorry, you know. And this governor did it when he was finished medical school. He wasn't 12 years old, you know. So at some point, you got to take responsibility for what you did. Doesn't mean you have to go into hibernate and never come out again. But you got to take responsibility.
Who's got the mic now? You tell me. There's a lady here, and then we'll go right to the back. And I've got your hand. There's a hand here, a lady right at the back. And yeah, we haven't had anyone from there. So why don't you give that gentleman the mic afterwards? Yes.
Thank you. Do you think that, going back to your point about Jews who don't always say the right thing, the media also have a part to play? There is an organization, you're talking about Jeremy Corbyn, in this country called Jewish Voices for Labour, which represent a very few people, and they're constantly given airtime, and that the whole name sounds as if they're speaking for the Jewish people. So people get conflicting messages because obviously, I mean, I'm Jewish, and presumably quite a lot of people in this audience are. We're more involved with it. A lot of people only see it tangentially. And therefore, when they hear something like that, and it must also be a problem in the States with Donald Trump, who has a Jewish son-in-law and a Jewish daughter who's converted to Judaism.
She's a Jew.
And she's a Jew, and yet the whole thing, it's never sort of reported. So I think it's very hard for people who aren't as involved as we are to understand the nuances, and the media and the both printed and television bear responsibility.
I think, you know, your question is about the media. I'm loath to beat up on the media, because that's one of the things that certainly people on the right are using. It's the MSM, mainstream media. It's all their fault, their lies, whatever. You don't like it, you call it fake news, because it's inconvenient. It's telling the truth. They called you out on your lie. I do think there's a responsibility. I think there are voices in the media that are very responsible. I think there are ones that are less so. I think there are ones that are, certainly in the United States, just are a shill for the Trump administration. But I don't want to beat up on it, because I think it's too easy a scapegoat, and it's used too much to silence. I mean, journalists are getting killed. Journalists getting killed for trying to bring this facts out of whether it's a Syria, whether it's a Sudan, wherever it might be. But I do think there is a responsibility. Who is this group? What is this group? And you got to do your homework. And there are newspapers. I read the New York Times on a daily basis, but on times I think and on occasion it slips up and engages in maybe more than slips up, but in kind of giving voice to people who don't really have much standing. But I don't want to just beat up on the media. It's too easy.
We've got.
I didn't mean the whole of the
media. Right. There are.
If anyone's in a hurry, sneak out, no problem. We'll take 2 more questions, I think, because otherwise we'll go over. So you've got the mic there, yeah.
How do we combat long-standing cultures of casual anti-Semitism in schools?
I think the same way. You've got to call people out. I went to Bickley, I don't know, someplace I went south on a train for a half an hour.
We are none the wiser, I have to say. At this point, we just don't know.
And I spoke to a group of about 400 high school students today, most of them not Jews, and I talked about what this is about and, how do you try to fight it. It's hard. I hear stories of Jewish kids all the time who they go to school and pennies are thrown, small coins are thrown in their way because, of course, you Jews want money and you'll bend down for any amount of money. It's very hard. I think it puts a lot of burden on the teachers to call it out. But it can't just be the teachers. It comes from the home too.
And from the syllabus, I would say.
Yes.
Actually, the way that, a history is presented through the
Absolutely.
syllabus, which I think is something that is often ignored.
That's right. So all those are parts of it. I wish I could give you a simple do 1, 2, or 3, but the problem is too old and too complex, and it would be belittling the complexity of the problem to do that. So I'm not dodging your question. I'm trying to be honest about it.
You, sir, are the lucky recipient of the last question.
And can I add one word at the end? Can I?
Yes.
Okay.
One more word?
No, go ahead.
Yeah.
You gave some really good tips on how to combat anti-Semitism on an individual level and in schools. But I wonder if there is anything that can be done on a more institutional level, like political parties or university bodies or something.
I think the fight that's been waged, certainly in terms of the Labor Party, has been a gallant fight. I give great credit to my friends and acquaintances here who have stayed within labor and try to fight it and try to fight it from within. Someone like David Hirsch, a sociologist, a very fine sociologist, who writes about, oh my God, am I going to be in trouble? Who writes about left anti-Semitism. Those are important voices and voices to be listened to. It's particularly often people on the right only see anti-Semitism on the left. They don't notice it next to them. People on the left only see anti-Semitism on the right. It's the weaponization of it, to use it as a political cudgel. Look at the person next to you. Look at the person with whom you have street cred, street credibility, and call them out. It's hard. It's harder to call someone out with whom you agree on so many other things, you might think of as an ally, but they've got to be called out.
Yeah, and I'm going to draw this to a close, but one of the thoughts that you had when you talk about how to combat it, I promise you I'm not getting sort of commission on this, but one thing that you do extraordinarily well, certainly for people like me, and I think I'm probably not alone, is just you give in this book the argument that doesn't sound heated, it doesn't sound hot, you just find a way of providing the words to fight back on something which, as you said, you know is wrong, you think the argument's wrong, it feels really uncomfortable, and you've provided arguments which I think are really helpful and thoughtful and lucid in a way that I'd never read before. So,
yeah, and if I can, I'm famous for trying to get in the last word, and why should this night be any different from other nights? But this comes from the heart. I didn't write this book, so that people would say, and I'm going to fight anti-Semitism because as a non-Jew I care about my Jewish neighbors, my Jewish friends, or as a Jew I care about Jews. That's a reason to fight anti-Semitism, but it's not the sufficient reason. Or for people who would say, I hate all kinds of prejudice, and this is such a long-standing kind of prejudice, I'm going to fight it because of that. The reason to fight, the reason to be frightened by anti-Semitism and to want to fight it is because no healthy democratic society can tolerate having that form of hatred in its midst. It will destroy the society from within. So if you want to become a combatant against anti-Semitism, certainly for the sake of the Jews, certainly for the sake of fighting prejudice, but most of all for the sake of the society in which you live and which I believe you treasure. Thank you very much.
Deborah Lipstadt, thank you.